So everyone, the basic tools that you'll need is obviously this 1 gallon carboy, which I've already sterilized using a brewery grade sterilizer called Star San. This one is a really nice non-rinse sterilizer, which means that after you've applied it and after it's sat for 10 minutes usually, at that point the ingredients in it are inert, so you don't have to worry about how it's going to affect the flavor of your food or anything like that. As you can see in this carboy, it's even still a little bit foamy in there. Don't worry about that, that's okay. You can have ingredients right in there with and on top of the foam. When you clean your implements with soap first, please obviously make sure that you get all the soap off and get any soap suds off. But the suds and the drying suds that you get from Star San are completely food safe. We're going to pitch our yeast, our Kveik, in this measuring cup here, so I've sterilized that. I have a hydrometer here that I'll explain probably a little bit more in the webinar as opposed to our video, while I will be showing you how this is used during the video that we shoot of the making of our mead. A couple of funnels, and then we'll use our hydrometer in this tube. You'll see an example of that. Our ingredients for this mead, honey is the main ingredient, but the real star of the show is the Kveik, or Kveik, depending on, I guess, whether you're pronouncing the Icelandic way or the Norwegian way, the Norwegian farmhouse yeast. This particular strain is Voss, and the other ingredients that we're using for this particular mead is apple, which I've chopped really small, and fresh ginger, which I've julienned, and a culinary lavender here. The lavender, kind of think of it as your hops, like for a beer. They're both a little bit for aroma as well as kind of your bittering agent. The ginger, as much as you might perceive a little bit of ginger flavor in your mead, it's more kind of an acid that builds on sort of the texture and mouthfeel of the mead itself. Apple, obviously, for flavor. So it's kind of a multiple ingredients there are all contributing to flavor. I cut all of these things really small, number one, because you want as much surface area for whatever you're using as a flavor to come in contact with your mead as it's fermenting. And next, the top of the neck of the carboy is kind of small, so once your mead's finished, you want all of the apples and everything to be able to come out of the neck pretty quickly as you strain that off once the mead is done fermenting. Next, we're going to mix it all up, and I'll show you what that looks like. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to do what's called pitching the yeast. You do the same kind of thing like when you make bread, which is where you'll have, like, depending on what kind of bread you're making, where maybe if you have like a warm milk and you put so much yeast into it, and then while the yeast is in the warm water, it starts kind of waking up. We're going to do the same thing with Kveik. Now, Kveik is a little bit different than regular bread or beer yeasts that usually operate around 75 degrees Fahrenheit for their fermentation. It likes that temperature. Like while bread's rising, that's kind of, room temperature is the temp you want to have it at. Kveik is a little bit different. It likes 93, 95 degrees Fahrenheit up to around 105 degrees Fahrenheit, which would kill other yeasts. So this one, I'm going to use a little bit warmer water that I'm going to pitch this in, and I added just a little dollop of honey that I'm going to stir in. Just want to make sure it's in there a little bit. And so it gives the yeast a little bit of something to snack on while it's waking up. And it'll help prevent what's called sugar shock when this pitch yeast gets into the main mead as we mix that in. Now you're going to put about half a teaspoon of Kveik in on top of your warm water. You don't really have to stir it. You can just leave it at this point. So from here, this process takes 15 to 30 minutes, depending, for the yeast to kind of wake up. So what you want to do at this point is, once you've added the Kveik on top of your warm water with a little bit of honey, you can just cover it with a paper towel or something and let that sit. Now, something that I do that's a little bit different, and I'll explain it some on the webinar, is I typically put on a little bit of music. It's an interesting kind of an old superstition for brewing, which, like I say, I'll explain later. So in this next half hour, I'll have music singing to the Kveik while it's waking up, and we'll be back. So it's only been 10 minutes, but apparently this Kveik is pretty active, so it got really foamy just in the first 10 minutes, which means that when I add it into the greater mixture for our mead called must, once I put that into the must and then we shake it up, it'll all be incorporated, and then we'll get fermentation. So I was talking a little bit earlier about how this likes a warmer temperature. Once we have all this mixed up, you can take your carboy of must that's waiting to become mead, and you can just put it in your garage. A hot day outside, just put it in your garage, leave it. 4 or 5 days later, your mead will be ready to chill and ready to drink. What I've done here is I've just mixed my initial amount of honey with a little bit of warm water, just enough to help dilute the honey out. You can use warm water for this. I would say don't use boiling water, because when you add honey and boiling water together, all the good stuff that's in the honey that you want to enjoy and that your body can use dies in boiling water. So don't use boiling water to make your mead, but warm water is just fine. So this is just the initial bit of volume, just so I can mix up the honey. And what we'll do, obviously, is we'll end up filling this up to the top with warm water. And then what I'm going to do is I'll take a gravity reading, an initial gravity reading, which is a measurement of how much sugar per volume of water I have, and a little bit more explanation about hydrometers work later. But I want to take a gravity reading of how much sugar has been diluted into my water per fermentation volume before adding any of these additional solid ingredients. Once I have my initial gravity that I want to start my fermentation from, I'll add these additional ingredients afterwards. In my cylinder here, the honey and water mixture that I've put together, I have the hydrometer in there, and this one is measuring around 64, 65, which that actual number is 1.064 or 1.065. You want to write this down and keep that for when the end of your fermentation cycle is. And then when you calculate the difference between those two numbers, it will give you your alcohol by volume. For this particular type of mead that I like to make, and the one that I'm showing you today using Kveik, it is a session mead. It's one that's usually around target gravity, is going to provide us just over 6% alcohol, which is a lot like an Oktoberfest beer. This is kind of a sweet spot for this particular style of mead, is 6 to 6.5. It can go up to around 8 if you have a pretty aggressive fermentation cycle. If you let it go longer than the 4 or 5 days that I usually let my meads go for 6%, if you go longer, the ABV value will go up to probably around 12% pretty easily. But that's a little boozy for my taste for the type of style of mead that I'm making here. So this one, hopefully at the end of this 4 or 5 days, the reading will change where it'll be like 1.020, 1.022, which means that when I take the next reading, the hydrometer will have sunk. And the difference is because the sugar and the honey is being converted into alcohol, which is lighter than water. So it creates this difference of an offset there. And that's how your hydrometer works. So here's all of our honey, our apples, lavender, ginger, all mixed in. So I'll give that a little bit of a shake after adding our Kveik. And get all those foamy bits and let all that stuff and all of that get in there. And you can see that even in just these couple of minutes between the last shot that I showed you and this one, that it continued to aggressively foam up. Now that I've got all of that together, let's give it a shake. Oxygen is good for it at the first part, being a living organism. When you do meads that go longer, you don't want to have a lot of oxygen reintroduced into your fermentation cycle, but initially it's all good. And that makes sure that your Kveik is all mixed in with all the honey, all your apples, all that stuff is all mixed up. The thing I'm going to do now is you can just use paper towel and rubber band, cap it off, put that in the garage where nothing can get to it, keep it all nice and warm. And I would say probably leave this to go for 4 days. At the end of those 4 days, if you're taking a gravity reading, you can check and see what your ABV percent is. Usually within the first hour to 2 hours that you've put this on, you'll start to see some really aggressive bubbling. And it'll look like a fresh poured beer or champagne. There'll be a lot of bubbles, and they'll all start coming up to the top. And depending on how aggressively it starts fermenting all of this together, it can foam up, pretty far. You can use, obviously, like brewers use those airlocks, but I just wanted to keep this, as a simple, to kind of show you how easy it is to be able to do this at home. This is something anybody can do. All these other special tools and so on, it doesn't really take. But it makes for a nice drink after a few days. So at the end of those 4 days, if you measure it and it's over 6% and you want to drink it, or if it's kind of a guess and you didn't measure and you want to drink it anyway, at the end of those 4 days, take this whole carboy and put this in your refrigerator and leave it overnight. And that'll do what's called a cold crash, which the change in temperature sort of turns off the Kveik and it goes back to sleep. All of those sediments will settle. Depending on how cold your refrigerator is, all of these ingredients like the lavender and the apples, all of that stuff will start to settle to the bottom too. If you leave it for another 4 or 5 days, it'll be just fine, but it'll continue to clarify in your refrigerator. But I typically don't go to clarification. I just want it to be cold. Then at the end of that, you just use whatever type of a handy sieve to strain this liquid into something else, bottles, another carboy if you happen to have one, and just wanted to keep that in your refrigerator to drink out of. But all you're going to do is just make sure that you have the mead that you've made totally separated from all of these solid ingredients, and then it's ready to drink. It's that simple. So I want to show you the finished product here. It's nice having a kegerator. Fresh mead on tap, who wouldn't want that, right? The thing I wanted to show you in here with this was that you can see that the mead is a little bit effervescent, which is nice. Kind of like a beer, Prosecco, champagne, maybe like a Spätlese German wine. Going to be sweeter, obviously. But that's it. It's simple enough that any of you can do it at home. Thank you for joining, and this is for you. Skål.